Picture this, a scream echoing through the stone chambers of Bletsoe Castle on a freezing January night in 1457. The wind outside claws at the shutters, rattling them like bones, but it is the sound from within, a girl's anguished cry that chills the heart. 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort writhes upon the blood-soaked sheets, her small body convulsing under a torment no child should endure. Flickering candlelight throws monstrous shadows across the chamber as midwives whisper frantic Latin prayers, their hands trembling with herbs and instruments that feel pitifully inadequate against nature's cruelty. At this moment, no one thinks of politics. No one thinks of kings. They think only of survival. But history is not so merciful. For within Margaret's fragile frame lies the future, the boy who will one day rise as Henry Tudor, ending decades of civil bloodshed and founding a dynasty that will change England forever. The irony is unbearable, a kingdom's fate hinging on the agonized body of a child. Margaret was no ordinary maiden thrust into this ordeal. She carried the blood of kings in her veins, a descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III. That blood, as she would learn, was a double-edged sword, a blessing and a curse. In 15th century England, where loyalty shifted like sand and power was always grasped by force, royal blood made you either a pawn or a target. Margaret would be both. Her path to this chamber began long before the pains of labor tore through her young body. Born in May 1443 to John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she was thrust from her first breath into the brutal game of dynastic ambition. Her father, once a trusted commander in the closing chapters of the 100 Years' War, returned from France broken in spirit. English defeats had piled upon his shoulders like stones, crushing pride into despair. Some whispered that disgrace drove him to his own death. Others claimed poison, that eternal specter haunting the noble courts of England. Officially, he died of fever in 1444, but Margaret grew up in the shadow of suspicion, her earliest memory shaped not by laughter, but by the echo of dishonor. For her widowed mother, Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, survival meant swift calculation. She knew her daughter's value was not in her smile or her innocence, but in the alliances her womb might cement. So when Margaret was only 6 years old, she was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. The match promised to tie two of England's great families together. Yet politics devours promises. Suffolk fell, accused of treason, butchered on a ship crossing the Channel. The betrothal, once gilded in importance, dissolved like wax near fire. In those years, Margaret was still a child playing in castle gardens, yet every playmate, every tutor, every whispered courtly word reminded her she was a piece on the chessboard of kings. The women of her family had long learned that safety lay in obedience and quick adaptation. Her mother taught her the art of silence, the strength of listening, and the necessity of submission to fate. But Margaret, even as a child, absorbed something else, the realization that silence could also conceal strategy. Her fate soon turned again. Before she could truly comprehend the meaning of her first lost betrothal, another came. This time to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. The Tudors' newcomers, Welsh upstarts with uncertain legitimacy, had risen through scandal. Their father, Owen Tudor, was a courtier who secretly married Catherine of Valois, the widowed Queen of England. Their sons Edmund and Jasper were elevated not by ancient blood, but by royal favor. And yet, that favor made them powerful and dangerous. The marriage was arranged when Margaret was scarcely 12. Edmund was in his 20s, a man tempered by politics and war. She was still shedding her childhood, more girl than woman. The ceremony was held at her family's Bletsoe Castle, beneath the same stone vaults where she had once played. The great hall was adorned with the tapestries of her Beaufort ancestors, reminders of both glory and tragedy. The chapel echoed with vows Margaret barely understood, words binding her to a destiny that felt like a foreign language. There was no patience for innocence in such unions. The marriage was consummated at once, a brutal initiation into womanhood. Margaret never spoke of that night, but her silence speaks volumes. Her body bore the consequences. Damage that physicians would later whisper about in hushed tones. Damage that meant she would never bear more than one child. The trauma did not just wound her flesh, it carved into her soul, redirecting her devotion toward God with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Months passed, and the girl became a bride heavy with child. But the man she was bound to, Edmund Tudor, would not live to see his son. In 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, Edmund was captured at Carmarthen Castle. Some claimed disease took him in prison. Others muttered about betrayal, murder, and silence purchased with coin. Whatever the truth, Edmund was gone. And Margaret, barely 13, was left a widow carrying the seed of a dynasty she could not yet comprehend. She received the news at Lamphy Palace in Pembrokeshire, praying in a small chapel as rain lashed against the stained glass. A messenger burst in, soaked and pale, and the words on his lips froze her world. Widowed, pregnant, alone. In that moment, the child Margaret ceased to exist. What remained was something else. A girl forced by politics, by blood, by destiny itself, to harden. And fate was not done testing her. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, would take her under his protection, leading her to Pembroke Castle, a fortress on the edge of the world, perched on Welsh cliffs above the roaring Atlantic. There, as the Wars of the Roses ignited across England, Margaret would endure her most perilous trial, bringing forth a son while standing herself on the razor's edge of death. The autumn of 1456 weighed heavy upon England. Storm clouds gathered not only in the skies, but in the realm itself, for civil war had begun to simmer. Yet for Margaret Beaufort, 13 years old and already widowed, the greater storm was within her body. She was carrying a child she barely understood, the son of a husband she would never see again. Jasper Tudor, her late husband's brother, stepped forward as guardian. His decision was not only chivalrous, but practical. Margaret bore the only possible heir to the Tudor line, a fragile thread that could bind their family to the future of England. He escorted her to Pembroke Castle, his fortress in southwest Wales. The journey itself was a trial. Winter roads turned to mud, swollen rivers made crossings treacherous, and rumors of roving bands of men, some Lancastrian, some Yorkist, all dangerous, forced the party into detours. Margaret, heavy with child, was carried in a litter jolted by every rut and stone. Each jarring movement sent a lance of pain through her small frame, a constant reminder that her body was being pushed beyond nature's limits. Pembroke Castle was no gentle refuge. It stood on limestone cliffs above Milford Haven, battered by relentless Atlantic winds. Its mighty round keep had withstood sieges for centuries, but its purpose was defense, not comfort. Drafts cut through every crack in the stone. The hearths devoured firewood, yet the chill persisted. Margaret's chambers were lined with thick tapestries, but still she shivered at night as sea winds howled like wolves through the arrow slits. The castle's physician, Dr. Louis Caerleon, a man learned in Oxford and Paris, steeped in the texts of Galen and Hippocrates, examined the young widow with growing alarm. Her hips were too narrow, her body too underdeveloped, the child too large. He spoke his fears in whispers to Jasper Tudor. If Margaret survived this birth, it would be by miracle, not medicine. Caesarean operations existed in theory, but in practice they almost always killed the mother. And so the household watched as winter deepened, praying for both child and mother. Margaret herself, perhaps sensing the enormity of what was at stake, turned with fervor toward God. Hours each day she spent in the cold chapel, her knees raw from kneeling, her lips cracked from endless prayers whispered in Latin. She clutched rosary beads until her fingers bled. If she could not command her body, she would command her soul. Faith became her refuge, her weapon against terror. Her labor began on a night in January 1457. Snow swirled outside the castle walls. Within, torches flickered in anticipation. Margaret, walking the battlements for the exercise Dr. Kerlon demanded, doubled over suddenly, her scream tearing through the winter air. The women rushed her back to her chamber, laying her upon a bed already prepared with linens, herbs, and relics. The midwives knew the danger instantly. A child bearing a child. Their faces tightened with grim resolve. Dame Gwen Daffyd, the head midwife, had delivered countless infants in her 30 years, aided by herbal knowledge passed down through generations of Welsh women. She burned lavender and rosemary to steady the girl's spirit, whispered charms for strength, and prepared knives, hooks, and holy relics in case nature turned cruel. Hours dragged into a night of terror. Margaret's screams echoed through Pembroke's halls, her voice breaking, until only guttural cries remained. Servants ran with basins of steaming water, their faces pale. Jasper Tudor paced outside the heavy oak door, hearing every sound, each one cutting him like a blade. Father Meredith, the castle's priest, prayed without ceasing in the chapel below, invoking Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, for intercession. 18 hours passed. Margaret's young body weakened, her skin ghostly pale, her breath shallow. The baby was lodged dangerously, its heartbeat faltering. The midwives exchanged looks that needed no words. They could lose both mother and child. Dame Gwen, muttering a final prayer, attempted the perilous manual extraction. It was brutal, invasive, and nearly fatal, but at last, with one final desperate push, the infant was dragged into the world. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The baby lay still, slick with blood and birth fluids, pale as death. The midwives froze. And then a cry, thin, ragged, furious, but alive. That cry carried through the stone walls, down the corridors, and into history. Henry Tudor had been born. Margaret, exhausted beyond reason, drifted in and out of consciousness. She barely saw the tiny form pressed to her chest for a fleeting instant before he was whisked away to be swaddled by firelight. She reached weakly, her lips forming prayers rather than words. In her fevered haze, she believed she had glimpsed God's mercy. But mercy came with a price. Dr. Kerleon confirmed in the days after that Margaret's body had been torn irreparably. The injuries were catastrophic. She would never bear another child. At 13, her reproductive life was over. Her body was broken on the altar of dynastic ambition. Recovery was slow and agonizing. Fever racked her, and the specter of death hovered for weeks. Dame Gwen spooned broth into her parched lips, while Jasper Tudor guarded the chamber like a sentinel, for the survival of both mother and son was now inseparable from the Lancastrian cause. Margaret's nightmares grew vivid, her screams in the night rivaling those of her labor. She flinched at touch, even from attendants. Her bond with Henry was complicated. She loved him fiercely, but each sight of him recalled the torment of his birth. And yet, within this fragile survivor, something hardened. Margaret's spirit, tempered in fire and blood, revealed its iron. She understood now, with startling clarity, that her son was not merely hers. He was England's future. If she was to endure, it would not be as a child or a wife, but as the architect of his destiny. The Wars of the Roses had already broken out beyond Pembroke's walls. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster clashed in blood-soaked fields, and the realm teetered on ruin. Margaret, clutching her rosary with one hand and her infant with the other, began to see herself not as victim, but as participant in the great game. Her faith grew sharper, her mind more calculating. God had spared her for a reason, she believed, and that reason cried in her arms. The birth of Henry Tudor had nearly killed Margaret Beaufort, but survival in 15th century England rarely offered rest. By the time she regained her strength, the kingdom itself was unraveling into chaos. The wars of the Roses family against family, cousin against cousin, would become the backdrop of her entire adult life. To secure stability, Margaret remarried in 1458. Her new husband was Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was modest, lacking the grandeur of her marriage to Edmund Tudor. She was still weak, her body scarred, and her spirit bruised. But this union was less about love than about safety. Stafford was practical, a Yorkist sympathizer, but above all, a man who could shield her Beaufort estates and her fragile future. For Margaret, this marriage meant compromise. She aligned herself outwardly with the Yorkists, even as her blood tied her irrevocably to the Lancastrian cause. In her private prayers, she begged God to protect her son, still under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales. Henry remained far from her arms, and she saw him only rarely. Each visit was a brief miracle, a child's face glimpsed like sunlight through storm clouds before duty and distance separated them again. Yet these years forged Margaret into something more than a mother. She began to manage vast estates, oversee finances, and correspond with nobles. Numbers, debts, contracts, these became her battlefield. She studied law and theology with the focus of a scholar, and her household grew into one of the most cultured in England. Chroniclers later noted that her personal library rivaled those of universities, stocked with works in Latin, French, and English. The Wars of the Roses did not only scar battlefields, they scarred families. Neighbors turned upon neighbors, and entire villages paid the price of noble ambition. Margaret, traveling between her estates, saw the cost with her own eyes. Barns burned, men pressed into armies, widows begging by the roadside. She learned early that survival demanded more than loyalty to one side. It demanded adaptability. In 1461, the tide turned decisively. The Battle of Towton, fought on a Palm Sunday in driving snow, became the bloodiest day in English soil's history. More than 25,000 men died, their bodies strewn across the frozen ground, rivers running red with blood. Edward of York emerged victorious and was crowned Edward IV. For Margaret, this was both catastrophe and reprieve. Her Lancastrian heritage made her suspect, yet her marriage to the Yorkist-leaning Stafford gave her a fragile shield. She walked a razor's edge, every step a calculation. But one thought consumed her above all others. Henry. What if the Yorkist king turned his gaze upon Wales, upon the boy who represented Lancastrian blood, however distant? Each night she lay awake wondering if soldiers would ride in the dawn with news that her son was dead. It was during these years that Margaret began to build what would become her greatest weapon: networks. She cultivated alliances with women, understanding that queens, duchesses, and noble ladies often wove threads of influence that outlasted men's swords. She corresponded cautiously with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's queen, while also maintaining covert contact with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled queen of the Lancastrian cause. Her letters, sometimes disguised as harmless household reports, carried hidden meanings to words that, if misread, could bring charges of treason. Meanwhile, young Henry grew in Jasper Tudor's care in Wales. He learned horsemanship, swordplay, and music, but also the rhythm of the Welsh hills and the loyalty of men who saw in him a quiet determination. He spoke Welsh fluently, absorbed lessons in survival, and slowly grew into the figure who might one day challenge for the throne. To Margaret, each rare letter from Jasper describing her son's progress was a sacred relic, a lifeline in the storm. Her marriage to Stafford endured 14 years, years of constant uncertainty. Henry VI was deposed, restored, and deposed again. Edward IV triumphed, was exiled, then returned in triumph once more. England's crown seemed to change heads as often as the seasons. Margaret watched silently, recording, remembering, and learning. In 1469, her husband Stafford was wounded at the Battle of Edgecote, a skirmish that left him permanently weakened. The wound festered, robbing him of vigor and embittering his loyalty to the Yorkists. Margaret, tending to him in long nights of pain, began the slow work of turning his disillusion into something useful. She did not speak directly of the Lancastrian cause, that would have been too dangerous, but she planted seeds of doubt about Edward IV's competence, repeating stories of corruption and neglect. Bit by bit, Stafford shifted from firm Yorkist to reluctant pragmatist. Margaret's transformation was nearly complete. No longer the terrified child bride, no longer the fragile widow. She had become a strategist. She learned to bend politics around her without breaking herself. She became patient, calculating, and subtle. Her letters became sharper, her negotiations more cunning. Where once she had clutched rosary beads for survival, now she clutched them for focus, as tools of strategy as much as devotion. By 1470, the political kaleidoscope shifted again. The Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, who had once raised Edward IV to the throne, turned against him and allied with Margaret of Anjou. Henry VI was briefly restored, a miracle that rekindled Lancastrian hopes. Margaret watched closely, her heart burning with possibility. Perhaps her son's destiny was not yet lost, but miracles in England never lasted long. Within a year, Edward IV returned. Warwick was slain at Barnet, and at Tewkesbury the Lancastrian cause was crushed. Edward, Prince of Wales, the only son of Henry VI, was killed, his death cloaked in rumors of battlefield murder. Not long after, Henry VI himself perished in the Tower of London, likely smothered on Edward IV's orders. With their deaths, a terrible truth dawned. Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, still a teenager in Wales, was now the last credible heir of the Lancastrian line. That made him valuable and marked for death. Jasper Tudor, understanding the danger, prepared for exile. The boy who had been raised in the Welsh hills would soon be torn from his homeland. And Margaret, once again, would face the agony of separation. The year 1471 marked a turning point so brutal that it seemed to rip the heart out of the Lancastrian cause. The Battle of Tewkesbury ended with the slaughter of Prince Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's only son, and shortly afterward Henry VI himself was found dead in the Tower of London. The bloodline that had held the English crown for generations appeared extinguished, but history has a way of clinging to unlikely survivors. With the direct Lancastrian heirs gone, Margaret Beaufort's teenage son, Henry Tudor, suddenly emerged as a claimant to the throne. His Beaufort lineage, distant and contested, was fragile, but in a land bereft of Lancastrian leaders, even a slender thread could become a banner of hope. That slender thread, however, was in danger of being cut. Edward IV, triumphant, could not afford to allow a boy with Lancastrian blood to remain in England. Jasper Tudor acted swiftly. In September 1471, he spirited young Henry out of Wales under the cover of storm and night. They sailed from Tenby into exile in Brittany, a crossing so desperate that it felt like flight from death itself. Margaret was not there to see him go. When the news reached her days later, the grief nearly broke her. She had endured years of separation, seeing her son only rarely. Now he was not just distant, he was across the channel, in a foreign land, and beyond her reach. Yet this grief did not hollow her. It hardened her. If she could not cradle her son, she would cradle his destiny. If she could not protect him with her hands, she would protect him with her mind. Margaret Beaufort, once a child mother bowed by trauma, became something new, a political architect, ruthless and relentless. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, died in 1471, leaving her once more widowed. The timing, some whispered, was suspicious. Whether by illness, his lingering war wounds, or other causes, his death left Margaret free. She made her choice carefully. In 1472, she married Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most powerful and calculating nobles in England. Stanley was infamous for his ability to change allegiance at precisely the right moment, always managing to end up on the winning side. To many, he seemed untrustworthy, but to Margaret, he represented opportunity. With Stanley's resources, soldiers, and political networks, she gained the reach she needed. Their marriage was not one of affection. It was a partnership of convenience, a cold pact built on mutual benefit. Stanley gained access to Beaufort blood and connections. Margaret gained protection and influence. Together, they became a power that even kings had to take seriously. From this point, Margaret's life became a study in espionage and strategy. Her son in Brittany was both hope and hostage. The Duke of Brittany, Francis II, sheltered Henry not out of loyalty, but for advantage, keeping him as a bargaining chip between France and England. Margaret understood this precariousness and set about weaving a web of communication across seas and kingdoms. Her letters became masterpieces of concealment. Some were coded, others written in invisible ink, or hidden within seemingly innocuous trade documents. A phrase about the shipment of wool might in truth signal troop movements. A blessing in Latin might conceal instructions to an ally. She relied on merchants, pilgrims, friars, anyone who could carry a message undetected. This was not the work of a noble lady cloistered in prayer. This was the work of a spy master. Margaret's intelligence network stretched across England. Servants in noble houses whispered news to her. Priests reported rumors from confessionals. Merchants brought word from ports and markets. Even women in courtly households, often ignored by men, became her informants. Through these channels, she often knew of shifts in loyalty and policy before Edward IV's own counselors did. But espionage was only half of her weaponry. The other half was patience. For years, she lived under the shadow of Yorkist suspicion, outwardly loyal, inwardly plotting. She cultivated relationships with both sides, careful never to overcommit. With Edward IV, she played the dutiful subject. With Lancastrian exiles, she was the silent hope. Her piety shielded her, a woman who prayed for hours each day, who sponsored religious houses and translations of holy texts. Surely such a soul could not be a conspirator. But beneath the veil of sanctity burned the mind of a strategist. Then fate shifted again. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his young son, Edward V, as heir. The boy king never reached his coronation. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne and became Richard III. Edward V and his brother, the princes in the Tower, vanished into the dark history of England. Most believed murdered on Richard's orders. Richard's usurpation sent shockwaves through the realm. Suspicion clung to him like shadow, and discontent grew rapidly. Margaret recognized the opportunity with terrifying clarity. Richard's legitimacy was broken. In that fracture, her son's claim could shine. Henry Tudor, the exiled boy in Brittany, suddenly appeared as a beacon, not only for die-hard Lancastrians, but for disillusioned Yorkists appalled by Richard's ruthlessness. Margaret acted with breathtaking audacity. She reached out to Richard's enemies, weaving together threads of rebellion. Through Bishop John Morton and other allies, she began to coordinate a rising within England while planning for her son's return from exile. The stakes could not have been higher. Discovery meant death, not only for herself, but for everyone she touched. The first attempt in 1483 failed. Betrayal exposed the conspiracy, and executions followed. Margaret narrowly escaped only because of her marriage to Stanley. Richard placed her under house arrest, stripped her of titles, and confined her movements. Yet even then, Margaret did not yield. Under the watchful eyes of guards, she smuggled messages through servants and allies. She plotted not only for rebellion, but for the future reign of her son. She lived each day under suspicion, each prayer laced with calculation. To her, exile was no longer absence, it was preparation. Every letter, every coin smuggled abroad, every whisper in a candlelit chamber became part of a single vision: Henry's return and Richard's downfall. And so in the shadows of England's most dangerous years, Margaret Beaufort became something her childhood self could never have imagined: a woman whose faith was her armor, whose son's destiny was her weapon, and whose patience made her as formidable as any king. August 1485. The winds of change swept across England, carrying with them the sails of a small fleet. On board, Henry Tudor, Margaret's only son, the boy she had last seen as a frail youth in Wales, returned after 14 years of exile. His landing at Milford Haven was no accident of fate. It was the result of years of Margaret's planning, whispering, and weaving of alliances. Every prayer she had uttered, every coded letter smuggled beneath wax seals, every risk she had taken, all led to this moment. The realm was weary. Richard III sat upon the throne, his reign poisoned by whispers of murdered princes and broken oaths. Even among Yorkists, doubts festered. Margaret had long prepared the soil for rebellion, cultivating nobles whose loyalty could be turned with the promise of a new, unifying cause. And most crucially, she had the Stanleys, her husband Thomas, and his brother William men, who commanded armies, and whose loyalty Richard trusted only at sword's edge. On the morning of August 22, 1485, two armies faced each other on the muddy fields of Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard III rode at the head of his men, armored and resolute, determined to crush the invader. Across the field stood Henry Tudor, uncertain but resolute, his claim to the throne carried not by birthright alone, but by the hopes of those disillusioned with Richard's tyranny. At first, the battle seemed evenly matched. Richard fought with ferocity, cutting through enemy lines in a desperate charge aimed at Henry himself. For a moment, the crown of England balanced upon the clash of swords and the strength of arms. But then, at the decisive moment, the Stanleys betrayed Richard. Their forces, held back until the tide could be read, swept against the king. Whether by secret promise or Margaret's relentless persuasion, they turned the battle. Richard died fighting in the mud, the last English king to fall on the battlefield. His crown, found lost among the blood and dirt, was placed upon Henry's head. In that instant, Margaret Beaufort's decades of suffering, patience, and cunning bore fruit. The Tudor dynasty was born. When news reached her, Margaret's transformation was complete. She was no longer merely Lady Margaret, the widowed child mother who had nearly died in childbirth. She was the king's mother. My lady, the king's mother, a title she would bear with formidable pride and wield with unmatched authority. Yet her triumph was not simply maternal. Margaret became one of the most powerful women in England, a force in politics, education, and faith. She founded colleges at Cambridge, supported translations of devotional texts, and ensured her family's dynasty was underpinned by both piety and learning. Her influence on her son was profound. She shaped Henry VII's cautious, meticulous rule, instilling in him the lessons of survival she had carved into herself through decades of hardship. But even in triumph, Margaret carried the weight of sacrifice. Her body had been broken at 13, leaving her unable to bear more children. She had lived her life largely apart from her only son, bound by politics rather than maternal closeness. Love between them existed, but it was wrapped in layers of distance, duty, and ambition. For Margaret, motherhood had been less cradle and lullaby, more battlefield and chessboard. And yet, she endured. The girl who had once screamed in agony at Pembroke Castle had risen, through sheer force of will, to end the Wars of the Roses. Through her, the Tudors would reign for over a century, giving England monarchs whose names still echo through history. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. Dynasties are often forged in steel and blood. This one was forged also in the prayers and unyielding resolve of a woman who refused to be broken by circumstance. In June 1509, Margaret Beaufort died, just days after her grandson Henry VIII was crowned. She had lived to see her son establish peace, to see the dynasty secured, and to glimpse the flowering of an England reshaped by her sacrifices. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey, carved in black marble, bears an inscription honoring her piety, her learning, and her role as mother of the king. But stone cannot carry the echoes of her life. They linger elsewhere, in the cold winds of Pembroke Castle, where a girl labored against death, in the hushed corridors where secret letters passed between hands, on the muddy field of Bosworth, where betrayal turned the course of history. Margaret Beaufort's story is not one of gentle motherhood. It is a story of resilience carved from trauma, of ambition sharpened by suffering, of a child who endured the unimaginable and rose to become the architect of England's future. She gave her body, her peace, and her innocence to dynastic necessity, and in return, she won a dynasty.